It all started on a quiet Monday morning, the kind that felt like any other. The school bell echoed down the long hallways, and kids scrambled to get to class. Ethan, a lively 12-year-old with a mop of dark curls and an endless curiosity for the world, had no idea his life was about to take a turn he'd never see coming. He'd been at Jefferson Middle School for years, knew nearly every face in his grade, and had his usual routine nailed down. But today, something felt different. As he walked into the cafeteria during lunchtime, balancing his tray of chicken nuggets and chocolate milk, Ethan noticed a boy sitting at a corner table. The boy looked strangely familiar, almost like staring into a mirror from a few years ago. Ethan stopped mid-step, his brow furrowed, trying to place this kid. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the boy wasn't just similar. He looked exactly like him. Same brown eyes, same lopsided grin, same dimple on the left cheek when he smiled. For a moment, Ethan thought he was imagining things. Maybe he met his gaze. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't some trick of the light or a weird coincidence. The boy was his carbon copy. Ethan felt a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, excitement, and a tinge of nervousness. Who was this kid? Why did he look exactly like him? He wanted to march right up to the table and demand answers, but something held him back. Maybe it was the surrealness of the moment, or the fact that he didn't even know where to start. Instead, he found himself sitting a few tables away, stealing glances while pretending to eat his lunch. The boy seemed completely unaware of Ethan's growing fixation. He was chatting with another kid, laughing at something on his phone. He looked so normal, so at ease, like he belonged here. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very off. After what felt like an eternity, the lunch bell rang, snapping Ethan out of his thoughts. The boy stood up, grabbed his backpack, and walked toward the door. Without even thinking, Ethan found himself following him, weaving through the crowd of students. He had no plan, no idea what he'd say if the boy noticed him. All he knew was that he needed to figure out what was going on. The boy turned down the hallway toward the science wing, and Ethan hesitated for a moment. This was his chance to confront him. Taking a deep breath, he quickened his pace and called out, "Hey, wait up!" The boy stopped and turned around, a puzzled look on his face. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. Ethan felt like he was staring at a slightly younger version of himself. His voice trembled as he asked, "Who? Who are you?" The boy tilted his head, clearly confused. "I'm Lucas." "Why?" Ethan opened his mouth to reply, but couldn't find the words. How do you even begin to explain something like this? Instead, he stammered, You look like me." Lucas blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to amusement. "Yeah, right," he said with a laugh. But then his smile faded as he took a closer look. His eyes widened slightly, and he muttered, "Whoa, that's weird." Ethan nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. At least he wasn't imagining things. "Do you go here now?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lucas shrugged. "Yeah, I just transferred. My mom and I moved here last week." That one sentence raised more questions than it answered. Ethan's mind raced. If Lucas had just moved here, there was no way they could have met before. And yet, the resemblance was too perfect to be a coincidence. He wanted to ask more about Lucas's family, where he was from, if he had any siblings, but the hallway was quickly filling with students rushing to their next class. Lucas glanced at the clock on the wall. "I gotta go." "Nice meeting you." Ethan," he said quickly. "Right. See you around, Ethan." And just like that, Lucas disappeared into the crowd. Ethan stood there for a moment, feeling like the ground had been pulled out from under him. He couldn't focus for the rest of the day. His teachers' voices blurred into background noise, and his friends' jokes barely registered. All he could think about was Lucas and the impossible question swirling in his mind. How could someone he'd never met before look exactly like him? When Ethan got home that afternoon, his mom was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She greeted him with her usual warm smile, but it faded as soon as she saw his face. "What's wrong, sweetie? You look like you've seen a ghost." Ethan hesitated. How could he even begin to explain what had happened? He dropped his backpack by the door and slid onto a stool at the counter. "Mom, do I have a twin?" The knife in her hand froze midair. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Then she laughed, though it sounded a little forced. "A twin? Where did that come from?" "I'm serious," Ethan insisted. "There's this new kid at school, and he looks exactly like me. Like, exactly. Same face, same eyes, everything." His mom set the knife down and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, you don't have a twin. I would know, wouldn't I?" "Are you sure?" he pressed. "Maybe something happened, like, I don't know, when I was a baby." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Ethan, I promise you, there's no twin. You were my only baby, and I was there every step of the way." Her words should have been reassuring, but they weren't. There was something in her tone, a slight edge, that made Ethan feel like she wasn't telling him the whole truth. He wanted to push further, to ask if there was anything at all, that she wasn't saying. But before he could, she turned back to the cutting board and changed the subject. "You're probably just imagining things. Lots of people look alike. It's called a doppelganger." Ethan didn't argue, but he knew what he'd seen. This wasn't some random lookalike. Lucas wasn't just similar, he was identical, and the way his mom had reacted, like she was trying too hard to brush it off, only made him more suspicious. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Ethan's mind raced. If Lucas wasn't his twin, then who was he? Could it be some kind of crazy coincidence? Or was there more to the story, something his mom wasn't telling him? He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, peering into the unknown. The answers were out there, he was sure of it. He just had to figure out how to find them. The next day at school, Ethan was determined to talk to Lucas again. He needed answers, no matter how awkward or uncomfortable the conversation might be. But when he got to the cafeteria, Lucas was nowhere to be seen. Ethan scanned the room, his heart sinking with every passing second. Had Lucas skipped school? Or worse, had something happened to him? Just as he was about to give up, he spotted Lucas in the hallway outside, talking to a teacher. Ethan quickly excused himself from his table and made his way over, rehearsing what he'd say in his head. But as he approached, he overheard something that made his stomach drop. "Just trying to get settled," Lucas was saying. "It's been a lot, moving around so much. My mom says this will be our last stop, though." The teacher nodded sympathetically. "That must be tough. If you ever need anything, just let us know." Lucas smiled and thanked her before walking away, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Ethan followed him at a distance, his mind racing, moving around so much. What did that mean? And why did it feel like Lucas's story was somehow connected to his own? Ethan was so lost in thought that he almost didn't notice when Lucas stopped and turned around. "Are you following me?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan froze, caught off guard. Maybe?" Lucas chuckled, though there was a hint of suspicion in his eyes. "What's your deal, Nan?" Ethan took a deep breath. I think we need to talk." "Like, really talk?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Okay. After school?" "Yeah," Ethan agreed. "After school." As they went their separate ways, Ethan felt a mix of relief and dread. He didn't know what Lucas would say, or if he'd get the answers he was looking for. But one thing was certain, this was only the beginning. The rest of the school day crawled by, each minute feeling like an hour. Ethan's thoughts were consumed by the upcoming conversation with Lucas. He kept replaying their brief encounters in his head, searching for clues he might have missed. Who was Lucas really? And why did his mom seem so uncomfortable when he brought up the idea of a twin? There was something bigger going on, something Ethan couldn't yet put into words, but he could feel it in his gut. By the time the final bell rang, Ethan was already waiting by the bike racks, where he and Lucas had agreed to meet. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Ethan spotted Lucas weaving through the crowd, his expression casual but guarded. "Ready?" Lucas asked, slinging his backpack over both shoulders. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was ready for. "Let's walk," he suggested. The two boys set off down the sidewalk, the noise of the school fading behind them. For a while, neither of them spoke. Ethan kept glancing at Lucas, half expecting him to say something first, but Lucas just stared straight ahead, his face unreadable. Finally, Ethan couldn't take the silence anymore. "Do you think it's weird?" he blurted out. "That we look so much alike." Lucas shrugged, but there was a flicker of something, curiosity, maybe, in his eyes. "Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's not like I run into someone who looks like me every day." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face him. "It's more than that, though. We don't just look alike. We're identical. That doesn't just happen." Lucas met his gaze, his calm exterior finally cracking. "Okay, yeah, it's weird. Really weird. But what do you want me to do about it?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, throwing his hands in the air. I feel like there's something we're not seeing. Like, maybe there's a reason." Lucas frowned, his posture stiffening. "What kind of reason?" Ethan hesitated, the words catching in his throat. He'd been turning over wild possibilities in his mind all day. Long-lost twins, secret adoptions, even some kind of science experiment, but saying any of it out loud felt ridiculous. Still, he pressed on. "Do you know anything about your birth? Like, where you were born? Or—" Lucas's expression darkened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "I'm just asking," Ethan said quickly, sensing he'd hit a nerve. "It's just, I don't know anything about you, and you don't know anything about me. Maybe if we figure out where we came from, we'll understand why this is happening." For a moment, Lucas didn't say anything. Then he let out a long sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, I was born in Fairview. My mom and I moved around a lot after my dad left. That's all I know." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Fairview. That's where I was born." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Seriously?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What hospital?" Lucas shook his head. "I don't know. My mom never talks about that stuff." Ethan felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was the connection he'd been looking for. "You should ask her," he said. "We should both ask. There has to be something." Lucas's jaw tightened. "Yeah, maybe." But the way he said it made Ethan wonder if he really would. They walked the rest of the way in near silence, the tension between them thick and heavy. When they reached the corner where their paths split, Lucas gave Ethan a curt nod. "See you tomorrow." Ethan watched him go, 1,000 questions swirling in his mind. Part of him wanted to chase after Lucas, to demand they figure this out together. But another part of him, the part that had seen the guarded look in Lucas's eyes, knew that wouldn't get him anywhere. Lucas wasn't ready to talk, not yet. When Ethan got home, his mom was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he walked in, her expression softening. "Hey, sweetie, how was school?" Ethan hesitated, debating whether to bring up Lucas again, but the memory of her strange reaction the day before pushed him forward. "Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said, setting her phone aside. "What's on your mind?" "Do you remember what hospital I was born in?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Her smile faltered, just for a second, but it was enough for Ethan to notice. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, her tone light but careful. No reason, Ethan said quickly. I was just curious. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. You were born at Fairview General. It's not there anymore. They closed it down years ago. Ethan's heart raced. Fairview General. The same town Lucas had mentioned. This couldn't be a coincidence. Did anything weird happen when I was born? He pressed, watching her closely. His mom laughed, but it sounded forced. Weird? No, nothing weird. Why would you ask that? No reason, Ethan said again, though he could tell she didn't believe him. He wanted to push further, to ask if there was anything she wasn't telling him. But the worry look in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he forced a smile. Never mind. Forget I asked. She nodded slowly, her smile returning, but Ethan could see the tension in her shoulders as she picked up her phone again. She was hiding something. He was sure of it. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. Lucas, Fairview, his mom's strange behavior. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture was still incomplete. He needed answers, and he couldn't wait for them to fall into his lap. The next morning, Ethan made a decision. If his mom wasn't going to tell him the truth, he'd have to find it himself. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his life had led to this moment, this mystery he was now determined to solve. The next morning, he woke up with a sense of purpose. If his mom wouldn't give him the full story, he'd have to dig deeper on his own. But he also knew he couldn't do it alone. As much as Lucas had seemed hesitant, Ethan was certain that Lucas felt the same pull toward the truth, even if he didn't want to admit it. At school, Ethan spotted Lucas near the lockers, chatting with a couple of kids. His posture was casual, but Ethan could tell he wasn't as relaxed as he seemed. There was a tension in the way Lucas held himself, like he was constantly on edge. Ethan waited until the other kids walked away before approaching. Hey, he said, keeping his voice low. Lucas glanced at him, his expression guarded. Hey. Ethan leaned against the locker next to him. I think we need to figure this out, together. Lucas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Ethan, I don't know. Maybe it's better to just leave it alone. How can you say that? Ethan asked, his voice rising slightly. Don't you want to know the truth? Aren't you even a little curious? Lucas hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Of course I'm curious. But what if the truth isn't something we want to hear? Ethan paused, the weight of Lucas's words sinking in. He'd been so focused on finding answers that he hadn't considered what those answers might mean. But he couldn't let the fear of the unknown stop him. We can't just ignore it, he said firmly. This is too big. Lucas looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, what's your plan? Ethan felt a spark of hope. We need to start with Fairview. That's where we were both born, right? Maybe there's something there. Records, people who remember, something. Lucas frowned. Fairview's a couple hours away. How are we supposed to get there? Ethan hadn't thought that far ahead, but he wasn't about to let logistics stop him. We'll figure it out. Maybe we can take a bus. Lucas raised an eyebrow. And what are we gonna tell our parents? Oh hey, we're just taking off to investigate why we look like clones. Yeah, that'll go over great. Ethan knew Lucas was right, but he also knew they couldn't wait for permission. We'll figure it out, he repeated, more to convince himself than Lucas. Lucas sighed again, but didn't argue. Fine, but if this goes south, it's on you. That afternoon, Ethan couldn't focus on anything else. Every free moment was spent Googling Fairview, looking for any clues that might point them in the right direction. Most of what he found was mundane. Small town history, a list of businesses, a few old newspaper articles. But then he stumbled across something that made his heart race. An article from over a decade ago about Fairview General Hospital. The headline read, Fairview General closes amid allegations of mismanagement and missing records. Ethan clicked on the link, skimming the article as quickly as he could. The hospital had shut down around the time he and Lucas were born, and there were rumors of shady practices, records going missing, patients being misidentified, even whispers of illegal experiments. The details were vague, but it was enough to make Ethan's skin crawl. Was it possible that he and Lucas were connected to whatever had happened there? That evening, over dinner, Ethan tried to act normal, but his mom kept giving him suspicious looks. He could tell she was still on edge from their conversation the day before. When she asked how his day had been, he just shrugged and muttered, "Fine," hoping she wouldn't press further. Later, when she went to bed, Ethan snuck into the living room and grabbed the car keys from the hook by the door. He wasn't proud of what he was about to do, but he couldn't see any other way. He texted Lucas, *, I've got the car. Meet me at the park in 20 minutes. *. Lucas's reply came almost immediately. * You're insane. *. Are you coming or not? * Ethan shot back. There was a long pause, and then *Be there. Ethan's hands were shaking as he started the car. He'd only driven a handful of times, and never without his mom in the passenger seat. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about finding the truth, no matter what it took. Lucas was waiting for him at the edge of the park, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "You sure about this?" he asked as Ethan pulled out onto the road. "No," Ethan admitted, "but we're doing it anyway." The drive to Fairview was tense and quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Lucas shifting in his seat. As they got closer to the town, the air seemed to grow heavier, the streets quieter. It was late, and most of the houses were dark, their occupants fast asleep. When they finally reached the old hospital, Ethan's heart sank. The building was abandoned, its windows boarded up, and its walls covered in graffiti. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, and a rusted sign hanging from the gate read, *No *. This is it? Lucas asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. This is it. They'd parked a block away and approached the fence on foot, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Ethan pulled a flashlight from his backpack, the beam cutting through the darkness as they searched for a way in. Eventually, they found a gap in the fence, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. On the other side, the air was thick with the smell of damp and decay. The hospital loomed above them, its broken windows like dark, empty eyes. Lucas shivered. "This place gives me the creeps." "Me too," Ethan admitted, but he couldn't back down now. They made their way to the front entrance, the door hanging off its hinges. Inside, the air was even colder, and their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space. The flashlight beam revealed crumbling walls, scattered debris, and faded signs pointing to long-abandoned wings of the hospital. Ethan's pulse quickened as they moved deeper into the building. He didn't know what they were looking for, exactly: files, equipment, anything that might hold a clue. But every shadow seemed to hide a secret, every creak of the floorboards a whisper of something long forgotten. Then they found it, a locked door at the end of a hallway, marked with a sign that read *RECORDSROM*. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This had to be it. This was where the answers were. But as he reached for the door, Lucas grabbed his arm. "Wait," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" Ethan froze, his ears straining. At first, there was nothing but silence. But then he heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps echoing in the distance. Someone else was here. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, each step echoing through the hollow corridors of the abandoned hospital. He flicked off the flashlight, plunging them into darkness. Beside him, Lucas was motionless, his breathing shallow. "Do you think it's security?" Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," Ethan murmured, "but we can't let them find us." They pressed themselves against the wall, trying to blend into the shadows. The footsteps came closer, pausing every so often as if the person was listening, searching. Ethan's mind raced. Who would be here this late at night? Security seemed unlikely. This place had been shut down for years. But if it wasn't security, then who was it? And why did it feel like they weren't alone? The footsteps stopped just outside the hallway where they were hiding. Ethan held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Then, a faint beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the walls. Whoever it was, they had a flashlight too. Ethan grabbed Lucas's arm, silently signaling for them to move. They crept down the hallway, sticking close to the wall, their footsteps as quiet as they could manage. The beam of light swung past them, narrowly missing their retreating figures. Ethan's pulse quickened. They needed to get out of there, but just as they turned the corner, the flashlight's beam landed squarely on them. "Hey!" a voice shouted. Ethan and Lucas didn't wait to see who it was. They bolted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing loudly now, the sound of pursuit close behind. Ethan's heart raced as he turned another corner, desperately searching for a place to hide. They stumbled into a side room, slamming the door shut behind them and locking it with trembling hands. Lucas leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. "Who was that?" he panted. "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "But they're not supposed to be here either." The room was small and cluttered, with old filing cabinets lining the walls and stacks of yellowed papers scattered across the floor. In the corner, an ancient computer sat atop a desk, its screen cracked and dusty. Ethan's eyes fell on a stack of folders, labeled with dates that matched their birth year. Despite the panic gripping him, he felt a flicker of hope. "Look," he whispered, pointing to the files. Lucas followed his gaze, his expression skeptical. "Do you really think there's something in there?" "We have to check," Ethan insisted. He grabbed one of the folders, flipping through the brittle pages. Most of it was medical jargon he didn't understand, but then he saw it, his birth date. His breath caught. This is from when I was born." Lucas peered over his shoulder, his eyes widening. "Wait, look at this." He pointed to another file, its contents eerily similar. The same birth date, the same hospital, but a different name. Lucas's name. "This doesn't make sense," Lucas said, his voice tight. "How can we both have files from the same hospital on the same day?" Ethan's hands trembled as he pulled another folder from the stack. This one was labeled with a strange code instead of a name. Inside, there were documents detailing some kind of experiment, references to genetic testing, terms like embryonic manipulation and twin study. Ethan's stomach turned as he realized what he was looking at. "They were experimenting on babies," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "On us." Lucas shook his head, stepping back. "No, no way. That's insane." Ethan looked at him, his eyes wide with fear. "Think about it, Lucas. It explains everything. Why we look the same. Why our moms never talk about our births. They must have been part of this, whatever it was." Before Lucas could respond, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by heavy footsteps. The door handle rattled violently, and the voice from earlier shouted, "Open up. I know you're in there." Ethan's mind raced. Whoever was out there, they clearly didn't want them to find these files. He shoved as many as he could into his backpack, his hands shaking so badly he could barely zip it shut. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice urgent. Lucas nodded, his face pale. Together, they searched for another exit, finally spotting a small broken window near the ceiling. It was barely big enough to fit through, but it was their only option. Ethan climbed onto the desk, pushing the window open and hoisting himself up. The jagged edges of the glass scraped his arms, but he didn't care. He pulled himself through, landing hard on the ground outside. "Come on," he hissed, reaching back to help Lucas. Lucas hesitated for a moment, then climbed up after him, wincing as he squeezed through the narrow opening. Just as he landed beside Ethan, the door to the room burst open, and the flashlight beam spilled into the darkness. "Run!" Ethan yelled. They sprinted through the overgrown lot, not daring to look back. The sound of footsteps behind them spurred them on, adrenaline pumping through their veins. They didn't stop until they reached the car, throwing themselves inside and slamming the doors shut. Ethan fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and they sped away, the hospital shrinking into the distance behind them. For a long time, neither of them spoke, the weight of what they'd just discovered settling over them like a heavy blanket. Ethan's mind raced with questions. Who was chasing them? Why had those files been hidden away? And what did their moms know about all of this? Lucas finally broke the silence. "Ethan, what if we were never supposed to find this?" Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that their lives had just changed forever, and the truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. The drive back from the hospital was eerily quiet, the weight of everything they uncovered pressing down on Ethan and Lucas like a storm cloud. Ethan kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights trailing them, but the road behind them was dark and empty. Lucas sat stiffly in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his jaw tight. Neither of them had the energy to speak. When they finally pulled into the park where they'd met earlier, Ethan killed the engine and let out a shaky breath. The silence in the car felt deafening. He reached for his backpack, pulling out the stack of stolen files. "We have to go through these," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lucas turned to him, his face pale. "And then what? What are we even looking for?" "Answers," Ethan said firmly. "We have to know the truth." They spread the files out across the car seats, the faint glow of a nearby street lamp giving just enough light to read by. Ethan's heart pounded as he flipped through the pages. Most of it was technical, charts, medical notes, jargon that didn't mean much to him. But then he found something that made his blood run cold. It was a list of names, two of which stood out immediately. Asterisk Ethan Carter asterisk and asterisk Lucas Miller asterisk. Next to their names were notes in small, clinical handwriting. Subject A, successful viability. Subject B, separated post-trial. Ethan stared at the words, his mind reeling. Separated post-trial, he muttered, turning to Lucas. "They're talking about us." Lucas grabbed the paper, his eyes scanning it quickly. "Separated, like they took us apart. Why would they do that?" Ethan shook his head, struggling to make sense of it all. Then another detail caught his eye, a second list. This one marked asterisk parent assignments, asterisk his mom's name was there, along with another name he didn't recognize. But next to Lucas's name was something that made his stomach drop. It was his mom's name. Ethan's mom. "Lucas," he said, his voice trembling. "Your file. It says my mom took you." Lucas frowned, grabbing the paper from him. His eyes darted across the page, and his expression shifted from confusion to shock. "No, that doesn't make sense. My mom raised me, not yours." Ethan's mind raced, pieces of the puzzle clicking together in a way that made him feel sick. What if they switched us?" he said, his voice barely audible. "What if my mom was supposed to take me, but she ended up with you instead?" Lucas shook his head vehemently. "No, that can't be right. My mom, she's my mom. She has to be." "Lucas, think about it," Ethan pressed. "It explains everything. Why we look the same. Why we were born on the same day. Why our moms never talk about it. They weren't supposed to raise both of us. They only wanted one. Lucas's hands balled into fists. So what? We're just experiments? They made us, and then they split us up like we were nothing. Ethan didn't know how to respond. His whole life felt like a lie. Every memory suddenly called into question. But before he could say anything, Lucas's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his face going pale as he read the screen. "It's my mom," Lucas said. "She says we need to come home. Now." Ethan's phone buzzed too, the message almost identical. His mom wanted him home immediately, her tone unusually urgent. A chill ran down his spine. How did they know? Had someone from the hospital contacted them? "We have to go," Lucas said, his voice tight. "But we're not done with this. Not even close." The drive back to Ethan's house felt like a blur, the weight of what they'd uncovered pressing down on both of them. When they arrived, Ethan's mom was waiting on the porch, her expression unreadable. Lucas hesitated in the car, but Ethan gestured for him to follow. "You're part of this too," he said. As they approached, Ethan's mom stood, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "We need to talk," Ethan said, holding up the files. "About Fairview, about the hospital, about us. Her face paled, her composure cracking. She looked from Ethan to Lucas, her eyes filling with a mix of guilt and fear. "I was hoping this day wouldn't come," she said softly. "What day?" Ethan asked, his voice rising. "The day we found out the truth. That we're twins. That we were part of some experiment." His mom's shoulders slumped, and she gestured for them to come inside. Once they were seated, she took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "You're right," she said finally. "You and Lucas are twins. Identical. But it's more complicated than you think." Ethan and Lucas exchanged a glance, their hearts pounding. "How?" Lucas asked. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "You weren't just twins. You were part of a study to see if genetic modifications could create enhancements, intelligence, health, physical abilities. But something went wrong. The doctors couldn't agree on how to handle it, so they shut the program down. And to cover it up, they split you up, gave you to different families." Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. "And you just went along with it. You knew this whole time." Tears filled her eyes. "I didn't have a choice. They told me if I didn't keep quiet, I'd lose you forever. I couldn't risk that." Lucas's voice was sharp. "And my mom? Did she know?" She nodded slowly. "She knew. We all knew. We didn't think you'd ever find out." Ethan's mind was spinning, but before he could say anything, there was a knock at the door. His mom froze, her eyes wide with fear. "Don't answer it," she whispered. But it was too late. Lucas had already opened the door. Standing on the porch was a man in a dark suit, his expression cold and professional. "Ethan Carter. Lucas Miller," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to take you both. You need to come with me." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Take us where?" he demanded. The man's expression didn't change. "To where you belong." Ethan's stomach churned as he stared at the man on the porch. The way he stood, calm and unflinching, made it clear that whoever he was, he held power. Lucas stepped in front of Ethan, his jaw clenched. "We're not going anywhere with you," he said, his voice steady despite the fear flickering in his eyes. The man didn't react to the defiance. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a badge. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said evenly. "But what you've uncovered tonight can't stay buried any longer. You have questions, and I have answers, but we need to leave now." Ethan's mom stepped forward, her voice trembling. "You can't just take them. They're my boys." The man's expression softened, if only slightly. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Carter, but this isn't optional. They're part of something much bigger than you realize. Ethan's heart pounded. Bigger than what? Some experiment that ruined our lives? Why should we trust you? The man sighed, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone else to arrive. Because if you don't, others will come, and they won't give you a choice. Lucas hesitated, his fists tightening at his sides. How do we know you're not just another piece of this whole messed-up puzzle? How do we know you're not lying? The man met his gaze, unflinching. You don't, but if you want the truth, the whole truth, you'll have to take that risk. Ethan looked at his mom, the fear in her eyes mirroring his own. But there was something else there too, resignation, as if she knew this moment was inevitable. He turned to Lucas, who gave a small nod. It wasn't agreement exactly, but it was enough. Fine, Ethan said finally. We'll go. But if this is some kind of trap. The man nodded. It's not. He gestured toward a sleek black car parked down the street. Let's go. The drive was silent, tension filling the air like a physical weight. Ethan clutched his backpack tightly, the stolen files still inside. Lucas sat rigid beside him, his eyes locked on the road ahead. The man didn't speak, his focus on driving, but his presence was enough to keep their nerves on edge. They arrived at a nondescript building on the outskirts of town. It looked like an office complex, unremarkable in every way, but something about it felt off. The man led them inside, past a series of security checkpoints that only heightened Ethan's unease. Finally, they entered a conference room, where a woman in a lab coat was waiting. She stood as they entered, her expression guarded but curious. You must be Ethan and Lucas, she said, her voice calm. I'm Dr. Caldwell. I've been waiting to meet you. Waiting? Lucas echoed, his tone sharp. Why? So you can experiment on us again. Dr. Caldwell sighed, gesturing for them to sit. It's not like that anymore. The program you were part of was shut down years ago. I'm here to help you understand what happened and why. Reluctantly, they sat. Dr. Caldwell opened a file on the table, one that looked eerily similar to the ones Ethan had taken. You were part of Project Genesis, she began. It was an initiative to study genetic enhancements, to see if we could create individuals with superior abilities. But the ethics of it were questionable at best. Ethan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. So we were just experiments? Dr. Caldwell met his gaze, her expression somber. At first, yes, but you were also human. Some of us fought to end the program, to give you normal lives. That's why you were separated and placed with different families. We thought it would protect you. Lucas scoffed. Protect us? You mean lie to us? Dr. Caldwell didn't deny it. Yes, but it wasn't just for your safety. It was for theirs too. The people who funded this program didn't want any loose ends. If they knew you were still alive. Ethan's throat tightened. What do you mean, still alive? Are we in danger? Dr. Caldwell hesitated, then nodded. The people who chased you tonight. They're part of a group that wants to restart the program. They believe you're the key to proving it works. Ethan exchanged a glance with Lucas, the weight of her words sinking in. So what do we do? Lucas asked, his voice quiet. Dr. Caldwell leaned forward, her tone urgent. You disappear. Both of you. We'll help you start over, give you new identities, protect you from them. But you can't go back to your old lives. It's the only way to keep you safe. The room fell silent. The thought of leaving everything behind, his mom, his friends, his life, felt unbearable. But Ethan knew Dr. Caldwell was right. If they stayed, they'd always be looking over their shoulders. Lucas broke the silence. What about our moms? Do they just lose us again? Dr. Caldwell's expression softened. We'll make sure they're safe too. They won't be harmed. Ethan's heart ached at the thought of saying goodbye, but he nodded. Okay, we'll do it. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Dr. Caldwell and her team set up new identities, new homes, even new backgrounds for Ethan and Lucas. Their moms were relocated too, given new lives far away from the chaos. Saying goodbye was the hardest part. Ethan's mom held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I love you," she whispered. "No matter where you are, no matter who you are, you'll always be my son." Lucas's mom said the same, her voice breaking as she hugged him. "You'll be okay," she said. "You're stronger than you think." And then they were gone. Ethan and Lucas found themselves in a small town halfway across the country, living under new names, attending a new school. It was strange at first, but they had each other. For the first time in their lives, they didn't feel alone. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their small house, Lucas turned to Ethan. "Do you ever think about it? What could have been if none of this had happened?" Ethan stared at the horizon, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "All the time," he admitted. "But maybe this is how it was supposed to be. Maybe we were meant to find each other." Lucas nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, maybe." They didn't have all the answers, and they probably never would. But for now, they had the truth and each other, and that was enough.